Good afternoon, everyone. So glad to be able to be with you again. Welcome to another Leaders Over Lunch, sponsored by your Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. But we're so incredibly proud today to be partnering with the Samaritans. And so we want to thank you for tuning in again. You have been incredible. And today we have an opportunity for learning that's long overdue in our community. We want to thank you for tuning in to today's suicide prevention and mental health in the Black community conversation. Again, I'm Dr. Keith Motley, typically serving as Chancellor Emeritus and professor over at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. But today, again, I humbly serve as a consultant, president, and CEO to the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts and co-host for Leaders Over Lunch. My co-host and moderator for today's special edition of Leaders Over Lunch is, as usual, the chairman of the board for the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, Attorney Joseph Feaster Jr. So glad to have you, Chairman Feaster, again with us today to co-host such a wonderful event. Before I turn the mic over to Chairman Feaster, however, I want to thank the staff that helped to put this event together. I want to thank Natalie Haywood and Alvin Peters, Nell Uter, and William Watkins, and also Charles Stewart. Thank you for understanding how valuable partnerships are. I also want to thank the Samaritan staff and Samaritan's leadership for partnering with us on this program today. This is an hour-long program. We want you to enjoy that tea or that coffee or that water or that sparkling water, and we want you to have some lunch and just pull up a seat. We want to thank you for being here today and understand that this is a conversation with men and women in leadership, in business, government, community development, and today not only in the healthcare space, but in the caring space. We want to have a candid conversation about strengths, weaknesses, threats, and opportunities that are important to all of us in this subject area. Today's topic is one that often goes silent in our community. However, we want to bring light to the subject of suicide prevention and mental health, especially during these challenging times, and how we can place additional support in place, both emotionally and often after the traumatization of some kind of episode within our community, how we can work to improve the conditions of people in our community. One of the ways we've been very fortunate to be able to do that at the Urban League is through our domestic violence prevention and other kinds of mental health programs that we have right at the Urban League for you today. Our guest today, Kathleen Marchi, who is President and CEO of Samaritans. She brings over 30 years of leadership, experience, and management skills to Samaritans. Prior to coming there, she was Director of Alumni Relationships at MIT Sloan School of Management. She served as the Executive Director of the Newton Partnership for Child Care Scholarships Fund, and also with the Newton Public Schools. So has an incredible leadership background. We also have Dr. Mathieu Bermingham. He's the Medical Director at Children's Services of Roxbury and founder of Metro West Center for Wellbeing. Dr. Bermingham is, as I mentioned, the Medical Director of the Children's Services, but also owner and CEO of Family Care Partnership. He's also president of the National Alliance of Mental Illness, Massachusetts chapter, and so many other things that we'll talk about today. But also we have Kelsey Manders, Community Education and Outreach Coordinator for Samaritans, who's going to be here today to take us through some of what is offered by Samaritans that we as a community can take advantage of. Talking about suicide prevention training and other kinds of initiatives that can be helpful to us. And so our agenda for today is robust. And so I know the chairman's saying if it's that robust, get out the way. But before I do that, I just think it's important that we start this way, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to take prerogative of the CEO and consultant to start this way today. You know, a lot of us in our community have been going through what some might describe as post-traumatic stress syndrome related to all that's going on across the country, from Breonna Taylor to George Floyd to the recent Deontay Wright, but also the attacks on our brothers and sisters from other communities. And so I just wanted to take a moment, 30 seconds of reflection to just sort of reflect on those things. And then I'm going to pass the mic over to you, Mr. Chairman, and my co-host, so we can get this started. So let's take 30 seconds to do that. Thank you so much. And Chairman Feaster, why don't you lead us through this panel? We're so grateful to have you here today with us.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Motley. And as typical, you have taken the type of leadership which has warranted why Urban League asked you to come and be our consultant, president, and CEO. You know what to do. You are timely. You are coherent. You are always on task. So thank you for recognizing how our community has suffered through these times. And this is some of what we're going to be talking about with the panel. But before I introduce the panel, I wanted to allow our partnership organization, CEO Kathy Marchi, to say her greetings on behalf of Samaritans as a co-partnership with the Urban League, and then we'll go right into our panel. So Kathy, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Joseph and Dr. Motley and Urban League. And I'm just honored to be here today with Dr. Bermingham as well. So very quickly to tell you a little bit about Samaritans so that you all are familiar with our programs. We're most well known for the 24/7 helpline that we operate. So people are welcome to call us 24/7, call, text, and chat. We'll share the phone number in the chat box so that people can have it handy. But we've also just recently added language line services to the helpline. So more than 240 languages are accessible through our helpline service for people who are more comfortable speaking in another language. People will find a compassionate listening ear on our helpline. We're there to support people when they're feeling lonely, in distress, struggling with something, and certainly, of course, when people are at risk for suicide and need to connect with someone. Our services are all free, so we certainly encourage people to use that service as they need. We have two other programs that are more that are less well known, but you'll learn more about our community education and outreach program when Kelsey presents in a little bit about our workshops. That's the prevention part of what we do. That's our hopeful, most hopeful piece of the work, that when we talk more about suicide, as we are today, and having this kind of conversation, we can not only destigmatize the issue, but we can give people language and give people some support in how to address this issue or address people who are struggling with other mental health concerns. And the third program, which we think is incredibly important as well, is our program for those who have lost someone to suicide, or suicide loss programs. We have meetings that occur that are run by other suicide loss survivors, which again, a very unique process of grief when losing someone to suicide. And those meetings are incredibly important. And we find, people are telling us how much they appreciate them. We are operating everything remotely since March of last year. So all of our meetings and all of our services are operating remotely and available, and will probably continue to some extent in that way. I also just want to quickly mention, as Joseph encouraged, that we have a very inspiring program coming up on May 25th, our annual Breakfast for Hope. And so you can find information on that at our website, SamaritansHope.org. Wonderful program. Joseph has been a speaker at it, inspiring stories from people who use our services or and support our work. So I hope you can join us for that. But thank you for that opportunity, Joseph. I appreciate it. And thank you again for facilitating this conversation.
Well, Kathy, thank you very much. I wouldn't be doing my job as an advisory council member from Samaritans if I didn't have us do our plug, and we'll remind folks again, because the work that we all do cannot go on without the support of our volunteers and the persons who fund our work. So it's appropriate for us to do that. And I never can put Dr. Bermingham on the spot, but I had not spoken to him about doing this. But as chairman of NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness for Massachusetts, from whom I've worked with in the past on their Boston branch of that, talk about what you're doing there, and then we'll go directly into the panel. Talk about some of NAMI's programs as well, Dr. Bermingham.
Sure. So NAMI, within the name is the mental illness. And we've had a debate for years within the community about defining ourselves by what may be wrong as opposed to what we do right. And as we'll talk more in the future, there's a concept that I would really want to encourage us to think about. There's a brother named Sean Ginwright who wrote a paper, Moving Beyond Trauma-Informed Care to Healing-Centered Engagement. And especially for the community of color, where we don't define ourselves by what's wrong with us, but how we've overcome. And so I would love to speak about some of the stuff that NAMI does in terms of facilitating recovery. And that's one of the goals that I hope will guide what we do in the coming years. And one of the most helpful things for helping us recover is supporting each other. So we have a lot of programs that's in our own voice, which is giving people who've experienced these conditions the tools and the opportunity to share their own experience so that others can hear and identify. There's Family to Family, which is a program to support the family members of those who are still learning to live with these conditions. And some, as you were mentioning, Kathleen, who sometimes the illness wins, where we're embarking in some school-based programs. A few years ago, we had a program called CEOs Against Stigma, where we try to get businesses aware about the importance of addressing the mental health needs of the employees and how depression is one of the major contributors to disability in the workplace, as well as presenteeism, meaning you're at work, but you're not really engaging efficiently in work. And so we've done a pretty good job of pivoting from having to provide these services in the flesh to using virtual technology, and where I described recently that although last February and March we had to shut our doors, we didn't shut our hearts. And so we're still doing a lot of work in that area, and there's some exciting things coming down the line. One of the most important things that I would like NAMI to continue to develop is a program called CIT, Crisis Intervention Training. It's a program we have with the police officers and departments in the Commonwealth to give them the tools to learn how to better de-escalate a mental health crisis. To me, the sadness of what happened with George Floyd is you had an ill-informed intervention for a mental health need. And I tell people, nowhere in any of my books that I ever read, you deal with a guy who's telling you he has a panic attack and agoraphobia by putting a knee on his neck. That's not how you deal with a panic attack. And yet we have people who are stuck in situations that they don't know how to handle, and they use tools that are not helpful. And we'll talk more about this maybe during this conversation, is there are things that are helpful. And it'll be important for us to know this both within the community and outside. So those are just some of the things that we're working on, Joe. Thank you for inviting me, guys.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bermingham. Thank you very much, Kathy Marchi. And we can begin our conversation. And we're coming at this from, and the reason why the three of us are engaged in this, and I'm moderating this particular panel because, you know, I've had an opportunity to walk the walk in terms of having lost my son to suicide in 2010. And so, and again, as Dr. Motley talked about, there's circumstances that are occurring, that have occurred, Breonna Taylor, in terms of the the Chauvin trial, and also the most recent, as you will, the death of Dante Wright. Our post-traumatic stress in our community, Dr. Bermingham, can be because of the violence, and we're finding that racism is in terms of a public health issue. We find out in terms of violence, in terms of as traumatic is almost what soldiers have faced coming home from war, post-traumatic stress syndrome. We just had the COVID and the increase in terms of mental illness. We have over 44,000 deaths from suicide, Kathy, across this country. Let's delve into it because we want to educate folks here. I can talk about it from the standpoint of a caregiver. You can talk about it, Dr. Bermingham, as a practitioner, and Kathy, you can talk about it from an organization that's dealing with suicide. So why don't we begin? Let me start with you, Dr. Bermingham. Let's set the stage about mental illness as you deal with it in your practice, the things that you experience, so we can, when we get to Kelsey, when she starts talking about the signs that people can recognize, they will be better prepared. So Dr. Bermingham, I want to talk to you from the mental health standpoint, Kathy, you from our suicide prevention issues. So Dr. Bermingham,
Sure.
you have the floor.
So to me, suicide is the end result of inadequately treated mental health needs. So it's almost like saying people are dying of a medical illness, but we don't know what the diagnosis that they're dying of. Most of the time when somebody dies, we ask, well, what happened, right? Unfortunately, with suicide, it's a very hard thing for people to talk about because so often we use language that describes suicide as a crime that you commit, as opposed to an illness that overcame you and the illness won. And so if you shift a little bit from blaming, condemning, criticizing, judging the one that's hurting and the family around them, to thinking about it as an illness or a condition that the resources were not able to be marshaled in time to meet the disease need, then I think we can think about it in a much more useful way, and in a way that gives to a lot more potential for hope. So that's point number one. What we know is suicide is the number 2 killer of young people of color 13 to 26. In 2019, it became number 2. It used to be number 3. Number 1 was accidents, and then homicide, and then there's suicide. Each of those to me are mental, social, emotional ills that speak and beg for solutions. We tend to think of suicide primarily relating within the context of depression, but suicide happened much more with the context of anxiety. And what I would like people to appreciate is most of the people I work with who've tried or think about suicide, it's not like they want to get rid of life, they want to get rid of suffering. And in their mind, life is inextricably connected to the suffering. So it's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but they don't know how to get rid of the bathwater, so they throw the baby out as well. Okay? And so if we can help separate the suffering of life from the living of life, we can make an inroad into the recovery process. Most people who've attempted suicide and get help don't repeat it, meaning that intervention at a timely way can be really effective. And it really is a hopeful opportunity that often we miss. And it's not a blame thing, it's about being aware of it thing. Stigma, as you guys all know, is what often gets in the way because people feel ashamed. But there's also a lack of knowledge and knowing what to do, and we'll talk more about that. But yeah, it's to me, suicide is most often connected to people feeling, I want to get rid of the suffering of life, and I can't figure it out. A young lady just told me it's almost like I don't know why I'm feeling this way, and I don't know what to do about it, so I get discouraged. I don't know. Do you see that, Kathleen? I'll let you guys.
Yeah, no, that was, thank you for sharing all that. And that is exactly what I think that's what makes it so hard for people to talk about suicide is that feeling of shame that there's some, I'm not trying hard enough. I didn't do enough to help myself, or people around me, didn't help me. And it really is that internal battle between wanting to live, but wanting the pain to end. And, we do very sadly hear that and see that and hear that from the people who we work with, who have experienced, as Joseph certainly has, that loss, is that feeling of what could have been different and how could I have helped. So one of the things we hope to achieve when people call us and when they use our grief support services is that opportunity to say, we're here with you. We understand and hear your struggle. And we want to support people in that moment, and not make an attempt, in fact, to brush away, the what they're feeling or experiencing in that moment. So to stay with someone and talk that through, listen to them. And then certainly when people have lost a loved one to suicide, that they have the opportunity to talk about what that experience is like, because that is so unique and such a different experience. And reducing all of this is an opportunity to reduce the stigma around it. When we talk about it, right, we take away that shame, we take away that feeling of I've got to work on this, I've got to hide it from everybody, and I've got to figure it out on my own. And I think one of the things right now, through COVID, is that some of the ways in which people find the support that helps them feel centered or helps them feel less anxious, less depressed, those things have not been available to us during this time, or certainly in a very different way. And so the idea that community, ways that we can re-engage or engage with people that we used to have more of a routine with, I think is really important in a helpful way, whether that's church, volunteering, meeting up with someone and taking a walk, those kinds of things that help us try to find that equilibrium, that balance that we need for our mental wellness.
Well, let me, again, as I pointed out, we're like a triumvirate here in the sense that we go from a practitioner to trying to provide the types of services, but also from my own experience, as you mentioned, again, Kathy, is one as a caregiver. In terms of one who has experienced that type of loss. And I suspect that there are some people who are on the call who have experienced that. And I just simply want to say that at least my approach is, one, to be very vocal and to speak out and to be connected to organizations such as Samaritans and NAMI and the Mass Association of Mental Health to try to help others. I also want to say, to one, don't play the blame game, because there's nothing that you can do. We have just become to understand, Dr. Bermingham, that mental illness is an illness. And so, you know, one seems to think the brain is not a part of the body, that is something else. But I try to, in my speaking, I tell folks it's no different from a heart, is no different from a liver, is no different from a kidney, from the standpoint of looking at it. And we would oftentimes play the shame game that we didn't want to talk about mental illness. I know back in the day, they would say, well, auntie is not taking her medicine. So we would shunt the auntie away and we wouldn't deal with the issue. So that's where it is from the caregiver. And I'm saying to folks, be bold and bodacious about what you're doing. And when we get to Kelsey and we talking about the signs, we got to deal with it. If someone, I always say, fell down fell down on the ground, everyone would come around and be talking about, let's call 911, etc. But if a person starts tearing off their clothes and running around naked, they're calling 911 not for the EMT, they're calling 911 for the police department. So we have to understand that as caregivers, we have to be sensitive to that, cognizant of that, and I'm hoping this program will do it. So that's my caregiver story. But I'd like to come back to you, Dr. Bermingham, and say, what are some of the, you know, triggers that you've seen as far as people who have exhibited mental health? And then Kathy, I know with our 24-hour, well, I don't want to steal Kelsey's thunder, so I won't have you talk about what are the triggers. I'm gonna leave that for Kelsey, but you may want to echo or add on to some of the things that Dr. Bermingham might say. So Dr. Bermingham, what are some of the triggers that you've seen in your treatment of persons who suffer with mental illness?
So in the field of medicine, we have this concept called gene-environment interaction. They've called it epigenetics, which are, we have genetic predispositions for certain things, including illnesses. But the environmental factors can play a crucial role in activating those genetic predispositions. And one of the most important genetic environmental interaction epigenetic factors is stress, and toxic stress, which we call trauma. And often we don't even recognize that we are stressed until we reach the point of breaking. It's almost like you had a weight on your arm, but you didn't notice the weight until your arm broke. So we have an ignorance of understanding, I call it emotional intelligence. We're very illiterate when it comes to emotional intelligence and understanding how our mind is telling us what's going on with us emotionally. We've learned over the years to recognize chest pain as a warning sign of a potential serious cardiac event. We've learned over the years of recognizing maybe drooping face or trouble talking or weakness on one side as a harbinger of maybe a cerebral vascular event. But we haven't yet understood sufficiently, in my mind, that when young people especially begin to act out, they're actually trying to tell us something. I keep a sign, and I share this all the time, that my wife gave me this when I started my practice, and I'm probably gonna have to take off my background so you guys can see this, because I think it's important to remember this, and it reminds me all the time. Knowledge speaks, but wisdom listens. It's by Jimi Hendrix, by the way, right? And I remind myself of this all the time. What am I not listening to? Because people come to us with things that are the result of unheard and unappreciated need, right? And we know the gospel song that says, he looked beyond my faults and saw my need. We need to think about understanding people from having needs, not just faults. And behavior is one of the surest ways for kids to communicate to us. And so if you have a child that's irritable, angry, acting out, or maybe they're not performing as well in school, they're not sleeping very well, you notice changes in their appetite, they start giving things away, they begin to not think about the future, they start describing themselves as being physically uncomfortable in their own body, they don't know why. They start just being sad for no reason at all. Those are messages. Those are but warning signs that we need to say, oh, so tell me what may be your need, not what's wrong with you, but what do you need? So that's the first thing I would love to do, is to educate the community in understanding the warning signs. That's like when we try to help people understand the warning signs of these medical conditions. What are the warning signs of these psychological conditions that can be the harbinger of worse things to come? And unfortunately, for the community of color, we treat the warning signs as we criminalize mental health in our country, and especially in the community of color. Okay?
Well, Dr. Mathieu,
Yeah.
Dr. Berman, I'm going to stop you because, like I said, I don't want to steal all of Kelsey's
Yeah, I'm
thunder.
sorry.
And I know that is hard, but I want to answer some things that came up in the chat. Someone said, "What did I mean by trigger?" What I mean is exactly what Dr. Bermingham said. What are the causes? What are the things that one exhibits in order in the area of mental health? And Dr. Bermingham has just mentioned that. Someone asked, "Why do we call the police?" Because that's what folks do, because they don't know any other place to call. Now in Boston, we have something called Section 12, and I recommend that folks take that down, Section 12, because if you make the call and you say you're having a Section 12 episode, the police department's response is different than when you just call 911. And I'll give you my own personal example that related to my son. He was in a study group that he was in a graduate program at Northeastern University, and he was exhibiting some behavior that someone on the line who was an EMT felt he may have been having an episode. He calls the person who's the head of the program and says, "Listen, maybe we ought to have a welfare check." They call the police department. The police come by our property in Boston where my son lived. He lived up on the 3rd floor. He was having an episode and was in a manic state. And when he did, what he did was to jump out of a 3rd floor window with a samurai sword in Roxbury. I heard police officers were coming from every direction, and it was a sergeant who tackled him while he was surrounded by police officers with their guns drawn. And that was just God putting a fence around him in order to provide that type of protection. When I learned of this particular incident, well, his first incident was one where I knew about Section 12. This was when he came home from college, and I knew about Section 12. So they sent the special ops unit, they sent an ambulance. That was the response when you have a Section 12. So I tell folks, if they call, because otherwise, in the situation that I just described in the second incident, my son had of jumping out of that window. If in fact he had attacked or came towards those police with that sword, I am sure that there would have been a different outcome as far as with my son. So remember Section 12, and to know that people call the police department because they don't know anyone else to call. And that's why we need to be looking at a different way in which to have responses when there's situations involving mental health. So I just wanted to give that. Kathy, I want to come to you because we're about 2 more minutes for us to speak, and then you're going to introduce Kelsey. So why don't you pick up where Dr. Bermingham and I left off?
Yeah, I think I would add a couple of things, because I think obviously Dr. Bermingham covered a lot of the important things to keep in mind when we're watching people, and Kelsey will do some more of that. A couple of thoughts. One is, that we would encourage people in certain situations to go directly to an emergency room instead of calling 911 if they're able to take someone who's struggling and they feel a need to find support for that individual, to go directly to an emergency room. So I just wanted to add that. And we certainly think that engaging in more conversation around how organizations respond to these situations, and thinking about that, the language, the process, the procedure, the resources is really important. And we want to be part of that conversation with the Boston community. I wanted to add that this time of year, which is often a time of year that many of us feel excited by spring and hopeful with this time of year, that for many people, this is not a time of year that feels that they don't feel that way. And so it is a time of year that we often see suicide rates go up. And that feeling that I'm not like everybody else right now. Often people think that the time of year with the highest rates would be around the holidays or in the winter months when it's dark and so on. But it's really this feeling of not being able to muster that that hopefulness of spring that can often be really debilitating for people. So Kelsey will share some warning signs and things to look for in people and pick up where Dr. Bermingham started. But I think that the added pressure of expecting to feel hopeful now that people are being vaccinated and we should be getting out and sort of coming out of COVID is adding more pressure to that feeling of needing to be able to, feel good, feel optimistic. So I just want to share that this is a time of year where we see a higher rate of incidents in general, higher rate of suicide in general. The long-term impact of COVID and the pandemic as a whole, the financial impact is another piece that concerns us. Financial impact, times of financial stress are when we see higher rates as well. So it's amazing that we're having this conversation now, because I think we can do a lot in terms of conversation. And I do think that some of these warning signs and risk factors and things that people can be aware of is really a helpful way for us to each take part in this. So.
And I want to thank, because we're going to transition to Kelsey. We don't want to steal all of her thunder. We can do that. But I want to thank Dr. Bermingham, to thank you and you, Kathy, for that. And if you can introduce, as Kelsey heads up the Samaritan outreach team, Dr.
Yes.
Bermingham, stay with us, please, because it may be, I'm not sure we're going to have any time for Q&A, but at least I know I'm looking at the chat, as Dr. Motley and I have learned to do. There are some things, and that's why I'm trying to respond to some of them. I just want to say before I transition back to you, Kathy, is that these are the organizations, people are raising certain questions. How can we do some things in the community? As you can see, this is an issue which Urban League is very much interested in. We work with many of our health centers. You have in terms of NAMI, you have in terms of the Samaritans, you have in terms of the Mass Association of Mental Health. Google all of those. I know all you folks only know how to use it. You can find the ways to reach it. I want Dr. Bermingham to talk about at the end, to give or put in chat how he can be connected. We're always looking for doctors of color, psychiatrists of color, in order for people ask me that all the time. So Dr. Bermingham, put your contact information in chat if you will. So Kathy, with that, can you introduce Kelsey so we can move to the next segment of the program?
Sure, my pleasure. Kelsey Manders is a member of our community education and outreach team. She's been doing presentations like this for over a year. Kelsey has presented to community organizations, with corporate settings, and in many, many schools throughout high school years and middle school ages. Kelsey has a degree in social work, a master's in social work from BU. And I'm going to turn it over to her now, and we'll cover as much as we can and allow a few minutes for Q&A for sure. Thanks, Kelsey.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kathy. And thank you to all of you for that conversation, both within the panel and in the chat. I've been reading both and listening, and it has been a wonderful conversation to be a part of. So I will try to keep to time, so we do have some time for questions. But what I'll be talking about really is what we do on the prevention team, just a really smaller, more concise version of it. So moving to the next slide here, I think Kathy covered pretty much all of our services. What I just wanted to mention or reiterate is that they are all free of cost, and that if you're interested after this presentation to bring a similar one to your community organization, your school, your workplace, whatever that might be, you can reach out to me, and I'm happy to tell you a little bit more about those services on the prevention side as well. So before we can move to the next slide as well. Thank you. So before we jump into really the tools of how to support someone, because I think that's the best thing that we can give to all of you at Samaritans with our expertise, is the tools of how do I support someone who's struggling. I did want to touch on those risk factors and warning signs that have been mentioned quite a few times throughout the panel. So first, risk factors. I spoke with sixth graders earlier today, and I always simplify it as it's anything hard, right? We all have different risk factors. They may be wax and wane throughout our life, and they can be from an individual setting or a systemic setting of lack of health insurance, things like that. So risk factors we can think of really broadly. Warning signs tend to come in some obvious forms and some not so obvious forms. So some of the more kind of obvious warning signs that we might easily pick up on are if someone says directly, I'm having thoughts of suicide. That's pretty clear. We know what they're saying there. But sometimes they range to the not so obvious of, a subtle phrase like, I don't want to be here anymore. I feel like a burden. Things where they're not directly saying to us, I'm having thoughts of suicide, but they may be having those thoughts underneath that. So in the behavioral and the physical type of warning signs, we have things that are pretty obvious, like the person stops coming to events, they stop coming to church, they're just really isolating themselves. Or one that's not so obvious is, they start giving away their prized possessions. And I could have a friend give me something that really meant a lot to them, and I might not think anything about their mental health. I might think that's really kind of them to give me that, right? So they really range. And what I always like to say is I think we need to start kind of tuning our ears and eyes to those less obvious ones, really hold them with the gravity that they have and follow up, ask a little bit more, ask them what they mean by those subtle statements, ask them how they're doing when we notice changes in their behavior or their physical being. So what we do at Samaritans when people call our helpline, when we support someone, is we break it down into 3 simple steps, which is listening, we ask some questions, and potentially start the process of getting help. So if you don't mind moving to the next slide, please. And you can click through twice to the do's and don'ts. When I say listen, I think it always sounds really easy, right? We can all say like, yeah, I've learned how to listen way back in grade school. But what we're talking about and what the listening that we use on the Samaritans helpline is really that active listening. So we really make sure that we have put away distractions. It can be so easy to be on the phone with someone and, texting away on the other hand or looking at an app. But we put away our distractions, give them the full attention that we have. If these conversations are in person, I know that's not always happening right now, we always suggest open body language. So I'm someone who I sit with my arms crossed a lot when I'm relaxing. So I always have to remind myself when I'm in these conversations, that can come across as closed off. I want to have my arms at my side, angled towards that person, not along, and create that warm environment that allows them to want to be able to talk about those things. Underneath all of these tips, the most important part is we really want to listen without judgment. And that's not to say that I'm asking all of us to be these perfect humans that never have judgments pop into our head. But I think that we need to first be able to start identifying when we're having those moments, really be able to notice them and take a moment to take a step back, work around them, and see how we can connect with that person. The 2 big don'ts of this active listening when someone's struggling is we don't want to talk about ourselves. We don't want to reflect on our own experiences. At Samaritans, we're coming at this as strangers on a helpline. So of course, we're not going to talk about ourselves. This may look a little bit different in personal relationships, but if you're the support person, we really want to keep that conversation about ourselves to a minimum, because even if it's not the intent, the impact can make the person feel like we're trying to kind of cut off to the conversation and make it about us. We also suggest that you don't give advice or try to solve their problems. This one can feel a little counterintuitive to people. I think it's a human kind of reaction to want to support the person we care about, help them out, and try to solve their problems. But a lot of the times when people come to us, they're not coming because they want advice. They're coming because they want the space to talk about what they're going through, to have someone listen to them. Through this outline of the listening, the active listening, the asking certain questions, and getting help, we use 3 main tools at Samaritans, and they're really helpful tools if you're ever the support person. And that is, we paraphrase what we hear. So we reflect back what we hear the person saying. If someone says, you know, I haven't seen family in a while, I'm back at school on campus, but I don't get to see anyone, I don't even get to go to my classes in person, I might reflect back and say, it sounds like you feel kind of lonely right now. You feel a little isolated. The second tool is validating. We let that person know that whatever they're feeling is perfectly okay, right? They're dealing with a lot. And if you don't mind switching to the next slide, the third big tool comes along with the ask part, the asking step. And our third tool is asking open-ended questions. So on top of validating that person and reflecting back to them, we ask some questions and further the conversation. The reason we use open-ended questions, you know, ones that they can't just say yes, no, one-word answers to, is really it gives them some space to explore what they're going through. It allows us to dive a little bit deeper into that conversation. Usually those open-ended questions begin with words like what and how, and as much as possible, we avoid why questions. The reason we avoid why questions is they can sound a little judgmental, or they can sound like we're asking for a very specific answer from a person. It can feel like that interrogation. Again, that may not be our intent, but that is the impact that a lot of why questions have. So I always remind people that, you know, if you accidentally slip and you ask a why question, it's of course not the end of the world, but we want to start kind of rewording those standard why questions we ask to begin with words like what and how. And then as we're asking that person some questions, we want to make sure that we're not afraid to ask questions about the painful things that they're experiencing. So again, I think another kind of human tendency when we see someone in pain is to try to, you know, paint a silver lining, make them see the happier side. But the problem with that is if a person came to me with their problem, with their experience, again, they probably came because they really needed to talk about it. They needed that space to explain the pain that they were going through. So at Samaritans, when we ask those open-ended questions, we do a thing called steering into the pain. We ask them questions about those painful experiences. And to me, what that really says is, you know, I see you in this dark spot right now, but I'm not afraid of that. I'm willing to sit here with you while you're in that dark spot. If you don't mind going forward, slide again. Thank you. And I apologize, the formatting, I think, didn't transfer an email, so apologies for the weird formatting here. But all of that being said, because I want to spend enough time talking about asking if someone's having thoughts of suicide and the resources I have, I flew through that, right? We had about 10 minutes to talk about this, and that's a lot of tips and tricks. So I don't want anyone to, you know, leave and feel like I can't possibly put all those tips and tricks into my conversations, and I'm already doing some of those don'ts that I'm not supposed to do, because it's not about finding the perfect words. These are things that we can start weaving into our conversations as we get more comfortable with them. But I think having an underlying base of being kind and compassionate really goes a long way. And then if you don't mind moving forward once more, and you can click through, I believe, 3 times here. Yes. So the one exception to that open-ended question rule is when we ask someone directly about suicide. So on the Samaritans helpline, everyone is asked this question. Of course, in your own personal life, it may be, you may want to ask it if you see those risk factors, you see those warning signs that we talked about earlier. And we want to ask it in a close-ended fashion because really we want a yes or no answer there. So what I have on the screen here is 3 ways that you can ask that question. And the reason I have 3 here is because often people will ask me if there's a way to ask this question without saying the word suicide. You know, a lot of us are not very comfortable with that. And what I usually say is, yes, but, and I have a little bit of a kind of caution there. So I do have one in the middle that doesn't use the word suicide, but I think gets to the point of suicide. However, I caution people that often when we try to avoid using the word suicide, we end up asking a question that's no longer about suicide. So a really common replacement is, are you thinking of harming yourself? And someone could be thinking about harming themselves and not ending their life. So chances are, if you've never asked this question, the first time you have to do it may feel a little bit uncomfortable. but you want to get as comfortable as possible with it, of using the word suicide, because the more comfortable you are, the more comfortable that person is going to be able to answer that question. Moving forward, please. And I know we have about 2 minutes here, so I'll wrap up quickly. I just want to talk about what to do once you ask that question. Because I think it's one thing to know, I can ask that question, it's okay to talk about suicide, all those things we talked about today, but a lot of the questions I get when I get this presentation is, well, then what? So if a person says no to the question, are you having thoughts of suicide? The important thing is we want to keep listening. They still need our support, and we really don't want to express any type of relief. And the reason we don't want to express relief is because they could be lying to us, or maybe they're not feeling suicidal right now, but 3 years from now they are, and they look back at that and they think, wow, Kelsey was really relieved that I said no. I don't know if she could have handled it if I said yes. So we always say, kind of hold back that relief and then debrief confidentially with our helpline as a support person, if it's in your workplace, with a supervisor. If the person says yes, the important thing is we want to figure out where they are on the risk level. So for lower risk circumstances, getting help can look like connecting them with a social worker, a therapist. If you feel that the person is at a high risk, if you feel they have thoughts of suicide, they have a plan, they have a time frame in mind, what you really want to do is reach out and get that wellness check that we talked about. As was said in the panel, the most common, I think, thought when people want to get a wellness check is calling 911. And of course, that is an option. And as Kathy mentioned, if that does not feel comfortable, there are other options, such as driving that person to your local emergency room. Or in Boston, there's the BEST team, which is a team of mental health practitioners that work 24/7 and will come out, do that wellness check to see where the person is in the risk level and what the next steps are for treatment. Next slide. So I just wanted to put up our helpline, which is in the chat. I wrote it right in the beginning here, but I wanted to put up our helpline one more time, because I also recognize that having this conversation today may affect people in many different ways. So please know that we're available 24/7. It's free, no charge associated with it. It's confidential and it's anonymous. And if you don't mind moving forward once more. I also wanted to put the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number, because as Kathy mentioned, I believe, on our helpline, all of our services are in English, but we do have translation services. So that's a great, really, addition that has recently been up and running. But of course, if you want to cut out that middleman of the translation services and you're working with someone who speaks Spanish as a first language, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline also has services directly in the Spanish language. And then the number below there is the number for the BEST team as well. And then I think there's one more slide. Perfect. So I'll wrap up so you can all answer questions and I don't take too much of the time, but I wanted to remind you all one more time that on our website, Samaritans.org, you can find out more about similar webinars. We host one every Tuesday at 2 p.m. that's open to the public. You can reach out to me to set up new ones for your organization. And you can see the Breakfast for Hope information that Kathy mentioned earlier. So thank you. I hope I gave enough time for questions. I flew through that.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. I appreciate how quickly and swiftly you moved. You've gotten a lot of questions from people asking about being able to see the material. So maybe we can share with you, LEM, the takeaway materials and for people to refer back to.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Joseph, are there questions that?
Well, there's Dr. Motley in terms of, I
Dr.
send it back to you, my good Dr. Motley, in the sense of if there are any questions, try to respond to some. I think that if William or Charles can tell us when this would be available. I know that in the chat, that seems to be the leading question. Folks are really engaged and want to get the information. So maybe Dr. Motley, you have those answers.
Well, Charles and team will get this up very soon. Before this evening, it'll be posted on our website. Okay. So we'll also look forward to getting those slides and make sure that they're available. There are several questions there was one that has been parked in the question and answer session, but a lot in the chat that's gone to each of us. The one that was parked in the question and answer piece was about Black and brown men and the kind of systems of care that are welcoming to them, but also what can we do to better address Black and brown male sexual abuse and those kinds of, that was that question that was parked there. And if there's any response to that before we get to the closing. But what we will do with the questions in the chat is get them to our professionals that are on here today, and we'll make sure that you're able to get those responses out. So thank you for that.
Do you want me to
Dr.
answer that?
Bermingham, would you be willing to take that question? I know it's been, as
Sure.
Dr. Motley said, it was parked in there. Would you be able to address that? That may not be, I guess it has a relationship to what we're talking about. Can you speak to that at all, or anyone else on the panel?
Yeah, essentially, we're speaking about trauma and its effect on mental health, right? And abuse is one form of trauma, but there are other forms of trauma as well. Trauma, I heard this morning a conversation about how millions of our kids are affected, for instance, by the ramifications of gun violence. Trauma is like the pebble in the pond that has ripples that reverberate far beyond the impact. And so we have communities that have been traumatized, right? You guys know about those concepts, right? Of the post-traumatic slavery disorder, some are calling it. And so there's a long historical impact of trauma that gets passed on to generation. And one of the ways that people get traumatized is through, intimate abuse as children and even as adults. And it helps to know that the behaviors that often are displayed as a reaction to the trauma is, again, an attempt to communicate a need. Mm-hmm. Not an invitation to criminalize, right? That's what I was trying to get to, right? Often misbehavior, especially in kids, but others as well, is a way to try to communicate an unmet need. And I would say that there are a couple of important things. I've put the contact information for Children's Services of Roxbury. I've given you guys the link to NAMI. The state is redesigning its whole behavioral healthcare system, called the Roadmap to Behavioral Healthcare Reform, that I put in the link as well. They will be having like a front door system where whenever someone in the Commonwealth is in need of mental health need, they'll call one number and they'll be channeled to where they need where their needs are needed the most. I say stay tuned to that because this is an exciting program. Nationally, it's been called 988. It's similar to the 911 thing. It's still being developed, so it's not yet available. The other thing is the churches. We know that when people of color attend church, those that attend church regularly have a lower rate of suicide. And it's really talking about social support, but also the role of spirituality in giving us a meaning of life and a purpose to our existence, right? And I invite the churches, and we can talk about this at another meeting, to play a really active role in addressing the need. I know Roxbury Presbyterian Church has a really exciting team dealing with community trauma and having meetings to help educate and support folks with trauma in their community. There are other churches as well. So that's also a place. And then there are the schools that we'll talk about maybe at another time. But it's really knowing that what helps us cope with stress is love.
And so we're spreading a lot of love today. Knowledge speaks, but wisdom listens. And so I know it's almost time for us to come off this call, but I'd like to say a few things here. One, Chairman Feaster, I want to thank you for sharing your personal perspective on this whole issue, but also being a committed advocate for suicide prevention and mental health. And if you don't know, Chairman Feaster has written an incredible piece that he shared at a conference in North Carolina that you, Chairman Feaster, if you're willing, should share with folk. I think it's an incredible piece that people need to hear. I also want to thank everyone. You're not guests, your partners that were here partnering with us today. One of the answers to that last question is that the Urban League has one of the most prolific domestic violence and sexual abuse prevention programs in the country right here in Boston, led by Reverend Tracy Antoine, who also has connected with the churches and has done a fascinating job working to make sure those things happen. And so to all of you, thank you for joining us today. I want you to know that May is Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts month. And so there's going to be an incredible amount of things that are happening. As you know, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. May is Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts month. We're going to have a Leaders Over Lunch on the future of work. It's going to be incredible in May, but there'll be several leading up to that. And we have an incredible special guest coming up just like today. But also May 20th is our annual Equal Opportunity and Diversity Breakfast, where we're going to be honoring some incredible individuals in Boston, but also celebrating diversity and inclusion. And then our career fair will be held in June. Yes, it will be held virtually, but it's going to be a fascinating event. And remember, you could become a member of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts and that site, or if you want to donate or become a member. You see, it's the ULEM.square.site. You see right here. And so go on, click on, be a donor. But thank you all for coming out today. We're so grateful. And until the next time, we'll see you. Thank you.